Hello all, welcome to another lesson, and this lesson is going to be on the method of content analysis. Okay, content analysis. In today's lesson, we're going to go over a few different topics. First, kind of just an overview of what content analysis is, the types of research questions you can kind of typically ask or examine with research content analysis. Talk about the issues of coding and analysis. And then lastly, kind of do a discussion I'll do a review of the reading for today, which I think is actually a great example of content analysis. Culture and Conflict, the portrayal of Blacks in U.S. children picture books through the mid and late 20th century. Okay, let's jump in. So, what is content analysis? Basically, what content analysis is that the data you're using to understand society and humans are the texts and documents that humans create, right? So that humans have various forms of recorded human communications, like books, letters, movies, paintings, right? And basically, those become the things that you're going to observe. That becomes your data. And so basically, content analysis is any document, any human artifact that has, in some sense, a message in it that contains some type or some form of communication, right? And so what we're really doing is we're understanding humans by understanding the messages that they have put into or recorded into the artifacts of the world. Now, these communications can be public or private. So they can be public communications like television shows or movies, but they can also be private communications, letters, diaries, journals. And so it really just kind of depends what you have access to and what you're doing. One is, with public communications, you have to be aware that, that communication is, the person doing the communication knows that they are sending a message to a mass audience, right? If you're creating a TV show or a movie, you know that many people are going to see your communication, whereas a journal or a diary is more private, right? You're writing that message for an individual or a few individuals, and so you're not people are going to speak in different ways depending on whether their messages are public and private or private. So you want to kind of just be aware of that when you're doing content analysis. So typically, content analysis is of written forms of communications or verbal, right? So things like books or letters, movies where people are talking, TV shows, where there's a story or a narrative. But it doesn't have to be written text, right? It doesn't have to be something verbal, right? There are other forms of communication, right? There are messages that are contained within paintings, within photographs, with even products that we make, like cars. There are ways of conveying messages in just kind of consumer goods. And so one example of a content analysis that is done not using verbal communications is the example of Goffman and his work called gender advertisements. And so what Goffman does is he does a content analysis of photographs, essentially magazine advertisements. And so what he does is he examines these images for the messages about gender that they are conveying, right? So the people making these advertisements, they don't know or they don't think that they're making a message about gender. But the idea is that there is kind of this hidden message or this kind of almost unconscious message that is contained in it. So, for example, one concept that he talks about is ritual subordination. And so this is pretty obvious in the picture on the left, right? Show her it's a man's world. You have this wife delivering a, coffee and breakfast to her husband. But it's not just the words that are conveying this message, but the images, right? That the woman is kneeling, she's lower than the man, and the man is outstretched, kind of looking powerful. But it's not just in this kind of traditional, older form of advertisement that's from like the 1950s, but it's more contemporary forms of advertisements from the 21st century, right? So for Gucci on the right, what we see is there's a message contained in here, right? That the woman is kneeling, the woman is lower down, just like in the image on the left. And so the point here is that when you're doing a content analysis, it does not have to be a content analysis of written communication, of letters or TV or books, but it can be, anything that humans make that contains some kind of message in them. We have to then, when we're thinking about content analysis, we have to go back to this idea of the difference between a unit of analysis and a unit of observation, right? This is kind of an important concept that we talked about earlier when we had in-person classes. And this is particularly relevant for content analysis. So let's kind of review this idea. So the unit of analysis is the type of thing that you are examining or analyzing in the world, right? It's your kind of conceptual object of your research. And so as I mentioned in class, your conceptual object, the thing that you're analyzing, could be individuals, it could be groups, it could be organizations, interactions, or social artifacts, right? And so you're examining these things and you want to try to understand something about them, right? That's your unit of analysis. But we also have a unit of observation, right? So the unit of observation is the thing that you're actually going to observe, right? Are you going to interview some individuals? Are you going to do a participant observation of some groups? Are you going to do some comparative historical analysis of organizations, right? And so it's the unit of analysis, your unit of observation are the type of thing that you're actually going to observe or study. So the important thing to understand, if we remember, is that sometimes your unit of analysis and your unit of observation are the same thing, right? You want to know something about individuals, so you observe individuals, but sometimes your unit of analysis and your unit of observation are different things, right? Sometimes you want to know something about groups, but you go ahead and interview individuals. Right, so that's important, right? So your unit of analysis and unit of observation are sometimes the same thing, but they're sometimes different, right? What's important to understand is that for content analysis, your unit of observation, right, unit of observation is always going to be a social artifact, right? That's what content analysis is. It's what your unit of observation are social artifacts, right? The things that humans have created, cars, silverware, comic books, movies, right? And in particular, we're observing these social artifacts for the messages that they contain, right? And so, kind of an idea here is that, let's say that we want to do a content analysis of 19th century English novels, right? So let's say that we want to do a study of England in the 19th century. We want to understand something about English society, right? We want to understand something about English people, right? All the English people who were alive during the 19th century are dead. Right? They're all dead. And so we can't interview them. We can't do a participant observation of them. We can't do anything. The one thing we can really do in the past in particular is we can do a content analysis of their social artifacts, right? So here I could do a content analysis of 19th century English novels, things like Great Expectations, Pride and Prejudice, Wuthering Heights, right? And so here what's happening is, with content analysis, my unit of observation are going to be these artifacts, these social artifacts, but my unit of analysis is going to be something different, right? It's going to be, could be the individuals of English society in the 19th century. And so content analysis, the unit of observation is always going to be social artifacts, but a unit of analysis could be something different. It could be the artifacts themselves. We might want to know how people wrote, or the grammar, or the use of literary devices, right? And so, but it could be we want to know something else. We want to know about the people or the society, right? And so with content analysis in particular, we have to be aware of this difference between unit of analysis and unit of observation and how they can be different. Another thing we have to be aware of is sampling. Right? So again, with content analysis, we're encountering some of these classic issues of research. So let's again do another review. Oops. Okay. Let's say that, so if you remember, what is sampling? Sampling is basically this idea of the difference between two concepts, the concept of a population and a sample. So your population is everything that you're interested in, everything that your theory applies to, right? Is your theory going to be all humans? Is it going to be all Americans? Is it going to be all English people? Is it going to be all New Yorkers, right? And then to understand something about that population that you're interested in, you're going to draw a sample from it, right? You're going to draw a subset of that population, and then you're going to observe that sample in order to understand something about the broader or bigger population. And then what you hope is that your sample matches or is similar to your population, right? Okay, so this becomes particularly relevant in terms of content analysis, right? So the issue with content analysis is there are many, many social artifacts. Right? Let's take the example of English novels, right? Imagine we wanted to do a content analysis of English novels. Could we read every single English novel that was written and published in the 19th century? No. There's literally probably millions of them, right? And so we could, or at least 100,000. There's a lot of them. There's too many books that we could read. And so when we're doing content analysis, we can't read all the content. We can't read all the objects. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out a way to sample, right? And so particularly in content analysis, you're always going to have to figure out how you're going to sample your social artifacts. How you're going to pick a subset of the population of artifacts of which you're actually going to observe for the messages that they contain. And so, the basic point here is that sampling is always really important, but it's particularly important for content analysis. Right, and we see this. We're going to see this today in the reading for today. In the reading, she talks about the authors talk about how they sampled the children picture books. Right, there was thousands and thousands of children picture books produced over the 20th century. And so they had to figure out a way to sample them. What picture books were they actually going to, look at, and how did they do that? And you can see, what they did is they had 3 different lists, 3 different sampling frames. And then one of the sampling frames, they did a random sample, right? That they got the list of picture books, and they just had a random selection of about 1,000 picture books that they picked from out of that list. Right? Again, believing that a random sample is going to be representative of the entire population. Okay. Oh, the last thing I also want to mention is that when we're giving an overview of content analysis, it's important to understand that it's a favored form of research because it tends to be inexpensive, right? It tends to cost less money for the researcher, right? You don't have expenses of going out and interviewing people and transcribing the interviews. You don't have expenses of doing a survey, or it's quicker. It's not as time consuming as doing a participant observation or an ethnography. And so content analysis is a good method because it tends to be feasible, right? You can really do a good content analysis, relatively inexpensively and relatively quickly. And so that's also kind of one of its advantages. Okay, so then we can ask, well, what do you do with a content analysis? Say you're going to do a content analysis. What is it that you're actually going to ask? What are you going to do? What research questions are you going to be really kind of delving into? And so what I would argue is there's a few different main research questions that people who do a content analysis look at. First, they wanted to say is, what is the message that is being conveyed? Right. So here it's description, right? What's the message about gender in these advertisements? What's the message about love in 19th century English novels, right? And so we're really just one really basic question is, right? If these artifacts contain some message that humans are giving, what is that message? What are the artifacts telling us? Second, we can ask, what are the social forces shaping that message, right? In other words, why is it that message? Why is that message the one being expressed and not some other message? And so here we're going beyond description and we're in some sense trying to explain. We don't want to just know what the message is. We want to know why that message is the way it is. Right? Why did the authors or why did the people creating that artifact, why did they produce that message? And what were the social forces behind that message? Right? What was happening in society that in some sense, made that message being conveyed? Right? Third, we want to know, okay, what about the audience? Right? So not just about what the message being contained, but also about the message being received. Right? So what is the audience going to do with that message? How are they going to be influenced by that message? For example, going back to Goffman and gender, right? People see these advertisements, people look at these things about gender and advertisements. How are their ideas about gender going to be influenced? Right? Or the 19th century novel example in Love, how are people's ideas about love influenced by these messages? And so here what we're doing is we're saying, well, we're not trying to explain the message itself. We're trying to explain, well, what does the message do, right? How is a message going to influence people? And then fourth, we want to say, well, how might the message change over time? So here it makes the research a bit historical, right? So content analysis is actually kind of a favorite technique with comparative historical research because you have messages from the past. You have novels and books and documents from the past that you can do content analysis on. And so what you can do is you can track these messages over time and you can kind of see how the messages change and develop, right? So we can say, oh, how did the expression about gender, how did that change over time, in these advertisements? And, what was going on in society, that made that change. So, these are some of the basic or typical questions that are asked when somebody is doing content analysis. Okay. This brings us, before getting on to the reading, this brings us to the third issue of what's called coding and analysis, right? So you have these social artifacts, you have these documents, you have your books, your novels, your computer games, and you have your sample of them. You're going to watch them, or you're going to read them, you're going to play the games. The question is, well, what do you do with that information, right? What do you do with your data, right? What do you do after you've read all the books or you've looked at all the photographs of advertisements? And so this is really the issue of coding, right? So coding is a process of turning your raw material of the media into something standardized, right? Something that can be analyzed in kind of in a way that makes it, give it some meaning and allows you to make sense of it, right? It allows you to observe the overarching messages that are being conveyed. So to do this, to code your social artifacts, there's basically two methods. There's quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. And we see both of these examples in the reading for today, which I'll talk a little bit more about at the end. Okay, so quantitative analysis is basically when you turn your media, you turn your artifacts into something numerical, right? You create numbers of them, or you count, right? So you count the number of times that love appears in English novels, right? You literally just count the number of words. You count the number of times that women appear below men in advertisements in magazines, photographic advertisements in magazines, right? And so basically with quantitative coding, you're turning your messages into some kind of number, right? You're coding them that way. Qualitative analysis is now you're not just turning your documents into numerical data, you're not just counting, but now you're describing, right? You're giving more of a holistic description of what the messages are, right? You're not turning them into numbers, but you're keeping them as words, you're keeping them as messages, and you're in some sense interpreting, what those messages mean. But either way, what you have to do is you have to code, or you have to kind of standardize or give a summary in some sense of what the messages are. And you can summarize those messages by turning them into numbers, or you can summarize them by giving it an interpretation, a description of their meaning. Lastly, before getting to the reading, we can talk about manifest and latent content. Right? So manifest content is the explicit messages. Right? Messages, what we can say, are contained on the surface level of the artifact. Right? So what are the characters saying? What's the narrator saying? What's the obvious message? But then what we also have is we have latent content. And so we can think of latent content as the hidden messages, right? So rather than something obvious, it's the kind of the more subtle meanings that are being implied, in the messages, right? So for example, going back to, these idea of gender advertisements, in the advertisements, the message is simply buy this product, right? That's the manifest content. You should buy these jeans, you should buy this makeup, you should buy whatever the product is that the advertisement is trying to sell you. That's the manifest message. But what Goffman is saying is that these advertisements, they also have a latent message. They're not, there's a kind of a hidden or underground message about gender that they're also selling you. So they're not just selling you the product, they're also selling you about an idea about gender. Right? So to summarize this all up, content analysis is really about, analyzing social artifacts to understand the meanings that are conveyed in them, and that how you're going to understand them is by coding, right? Like giving a summary of their meanings, either by quantitatively turning them into numbers or doing a qualitative description. Okay, let's turn then to the reading for today. It's really interesting reading, actually, and it's a good example of content analysis. And so basically what the authors have done is described, how these picture books are telling a story not just about, for children, but they're telling a story about race, right? They're telling us about race relations in America, right? And so it really is a story about, the representation of Black Americans. And so what they want to know is, how has the representation of Black Americans in culture, how have that changed over time in America in the 20th century? Right? Are Black Americans represented more? Has there become more visibility of Black Americans? And so one way to get this is to look at one form of culture, that's children's picture books. And children's picture books are particularly relevant because, children are impressionable, right? They are going to be, shaped by their early experiences, and their early experiences of picture books are going to affect them, might affect them, more than they know. And so what they really want to do, the authors want to track is, about the experience of the representation of Black characters in children's picture books and what that tells us about American society and how that society has changed over time. So we can see a couple things of the things that we had just talked about. So first here in this graph, we see quantitative coding. Right? So what they did in one way is they simply coded the number of times that Black characters appeared in children's picture books. And they split it up into these different eras. So in the early period, it was pretty rare. Then in the 1950s, 1960s, it became really almost non-existent. There was very few Black characters. But then in a more contemporary period of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, then Black characters made a resurgence and became even more common. And so that's a really good example of quantitative analysis. Just kind of counting, the number of times that Black characters appear. But they also do qualitative analysis. It's not just numbers, but they also describe how are Black characters represented in these children's picture books. And so they described how in the early period, there was these kind of subservient roles. So Black characters as helping as kind of helpers or things like this. Kind of see this in this picture here. Black character as kind of a stable hand helping with a horse, right? And so they're a really good example of qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis and how you can use them together. We can see some of the research questions that they asked. How they you were asking, what are the messages contained in these children's books? How are the messages shaped by social forces? So they also talk about racial conflict. How did racial conflict in America affect the representation of Black characters? They talk about how the messages changed over time. So, really good example of the type, these fundamental questions that can be asked using content analysis. And it's really just a really good way to get at this topic of race. Race is a touchy topic. It can be hard to, people don't want to talk about it sometimes, so it can be hard to interview people about it. But they found a way to get at this topic of race by looking at, cultural artifacts and something really basic, children's picture books. And so I really think that this is, in some sense, a great example of content analysis because it's able to deal with a very important topic like race, but get at it in a very unique way by looking at children's picture books. That's it for today's lesson.